The morning I signed my marriage certificate, I made a decision that my father would have called the smartest thing I'd ever done. I didn't tell my husband about the company my father left me. Not the shares, not the lake house in Vermont, not the account my father had quietly built over 40 years of running a small but profitable packaging manufacturer in Ohio. My husband knew I came from a comfortable family. He knew my father had passed 3 years before our wedding. What he didn't know was the specific shape of what that meant. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I wasn't hiding things from my husband because I didn't trust him. I was hiding things because 6 weeks before our wedding, at the engagement party his family hosted at their home in Scottsdale, my mother-in-law pulled me aside near the kitchen doorway and asked me with a smile so practiced it looked almost genuine whether my father had left me anything significant. She said it the way someone says it when they already suspect the answer. She tilted her head slightly, she held her wine glass with both hands, and she said, "Your family's business. I imagine there were assets involved when your father passed." I told her my father's estate had been handled by the family attorney and that everything was in order. I kept my voice light, I changed the subject to the centerpieces, but I didn't forget that question. I didn't forget the specific word she chose, assets, or the fact that she asked it before I was even legally part of her family. 2 weeks after the engagement party, I drove to Columbus and sat across from my father's attorney, a methodical man who had known my family for 20 years. I told him I was getting married and I wanted to restructure how I held the company shares. We talked for 3 hours. When I left, the shares my father had left me were held inside a revocable trust I had established in my name alone, with a separate trustee. The lake house in Vermont had been similarly protected. The operating account for the company remained in my name under the trust structure untouched. I did not tell my husband. I told myself I would explain it after the wedding when things had settled. I told myself it wasn't a secret, it was just timing. Our wedding was in April. It was a small ceremony in Nashville where we both lived, at a venue my husband had loved since he was a child. His family came from Scottsdale, mine came from Columbus and from a small town in Indiana where my mother's side of the family had lived for generations. My mother cried during the vows. My mother-in-law took photographs on her phone and texted them to someone the entire time. The first 6 weeks of our marriage were ordinary in the way that all first weeks of marriage are ordinary, adjusting to shared closet space, figuring out whose alarm clock was louder, cooking dinner together on Tuesday nights because we had decided Tuesday was the night we would always cook together. My husband worked in commercial real estate. He was good at his job, patient with clients, and genuinely kind in the way that made me feel most mornings that I had chosen well. I loved him. I want to make sure that's clear, because what came next had nothing to do with him and everything to do with who he came from. It was a Thursday afternoon in early June when my mother-in-law arrived at our house. I had not been told she was coming. My husband was at a client site 3 hours outside Nashville and wasn't expected back until evening. I heard the doorbell and opened the front door to find my mother-in-law standing on our porch in a cream-colored blazer, and beside her a man I didn't recognize carrying a leather folio. He was in his mid-50s, wearing a suit that was slightly too formal for a Thursday afternoon in Nashville, and he introduced himself as an attorney who handled family estate matters. My mother-in-law smiled the same smile from the engagement party kitchen. She said she hoped she wasn't interrupting anything. She said she had been meaning to come by and that since she was passing through Nashville anyway, she thought this would be a good time to have a conversation. I invited them in because I didn't yet know what I was walking into, and because I had been raised to be polite even when my instincts were telling me something else. I offered them water. My mother-in-law declined. The attorney set his folio on our kitchen table and opened it. "I wanted to talk with you about something that concerns the whole family now," my mother-in-law said. She sat down at my kitchen table as though she had sat there many times before. "My son's business has been under some strain. I imagine he's mentioned it. My husband had mentioned that the commercial real estate market had been difficult. He had not mentioned anything that sounded like a crisis. There are some financial pressures, she continued, and I think it would be meaningful. It would really show what kind of partnership this marriage is if you were willing to contribute to helping stabilize things, given what your father left you. I sat very still. I asked her what she meant by contribute. The attorney opened his folio. There were documents inside. He slid one across the table toward me and explained that it was a financial transfer authorization, which would allow a portion of the assets held in my name to be redirected toward a family holding entity that my mother-in-law managed. He said it was a standard document. He said it was entirely voluntary. I looked at the document. Then I looked at my mother-in-law. I said, "I'm not sure I understand. You came to my home on a Thursday afternoon without telling me you were coming, with an attorney and a document." She said she thought it would be better to handle it quietly, just between family. I asked her how she knew what my father had left me. She said that family is family and that she had wanted to understand the full picture of what her son was entering into. I said, "I never told you or my husband the details of my father's estate." There was a pause. She looked at the attorney briefly and then back at me. She said that she had simply done her due diligence, as any mother would. I slid the document back across the table. I said, "I'd like you both to leave now. I'm going to call my own attorney, and then I'm going to call my husband." My mother-in-law's expression didn't change immediately. The smile stayed in place for about 3 seconds longer than it should have, and then it adjusted into something cooler. She said she hoped I would think carefully about what kind of wife I wanted to be. She said that in a real marriage, you don't draw lines around what's yours and what isn't. I stood up and walked to the front door and held it open. After they left, I stood in my kitchen for a long time. The documents they had brought were still on my table because the attorney had left them. I didn't touch them. I called my father's attorney in Columbus, explained what had just happened, and listened to him tell me with a calm that I found genuinely steadying, that because of the trust structure we had set up before my wedding, there was nothing my mother-in-law or any attorney she hired could compel me to sign. The assets were protected. The document on my table was meaningless. What she had shown up with was theater. Expensive, well-dressed theater. Then I called my husband. He answered on the second ring. He was still at the client site. I told him his mother had come to our house with an attorney and documents, asking me to transfer assets from my father's estate to a family holding entity. There was silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "She did what?" I told him again. I told him about the attorney with the folio. I told him about the documents on the kitchen table. I told him about how she described it as something that would show what kind of wife I was. I told him everything in the order it happened, and I kept my voice level because I had decided before he answered that I would not be the one to perform the emotion of this situation. I would give him the facts. I would let him have his own reaction. He was home in 4 hours instead of the expected 6. He had called his mother from the car. I knew this because he told me when he walked through the door, and because I could see from the set of his jaw that the conversation had not been gentle. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had sat 3 hours earlier, and he read the document the attorney had left. He read it twice. Then he looked at me and he said, "I didn't know about any financial trouble. She never told me anything like this was happening." I believed him. I want to say that clearly, because some people in my position wouldn't have, and I understand why, but I believed him. He had never asked me about my father's estate in the way that suggested he was cataloging my assets. He had never shown any interest in what I'd inherited beyond a general understanding that my family was comfortable. He was not part of this. What emerged over the next few days as he had more conversations with his mother and eventually with his father, who had been kept out of the planning entirely, was this. The family business, a property management company his mother had been running largely independently, had accumulated significant debt over the last 3 years. His mother had not told his father the full scope of it. She had not told my husband. Instead, she had hired someone to research my background after our engagement was announced, and what that research had found was a public record reference to my father's estate filing in Ohio, which mentioned the company by name and provided a general valuation. She had then devised what she believed was a straightforward solution: get her new daughter-in-law to voluntarily transfer enough to cover the shortfall, framed as a family contribution, documented with just enough legal language to feel official. What she had not known was that the trust structure I had established before my wedding had already moved those assets out of the configuration the public record reflected. The document she had brought was built on information that was, by the time she arrived at my door, months out of date. I didn't feel triumphant about that exactly. I felt something closer to grief, because sitting across from my husband while he processed what his mother had done, I could see what it was costing him. He's a loyal person. Loyalty is one of the things I love most about him. Watching that loyalty get complicated in real time. Watching him understand that the woman who raised him had walked into his home and tried to use his marriage as a financial instrument, that was not a moment I took any satisfaction in. But I also want to say this plainly. For decades, he drove to client sites in February when it was icy and difficult, and no one else wanted to go. He negotiated contracts and managed people and worried the way small business owners worry about everything from supply costs to whether the parking lot needed repaving. When he died, he left me something that represented all of those mornings. I was not going to sign that away at my kitchen table to a woman who had shown up without warning and called it family. My husband told his mother that she would need to address the business debt through legitimate channels, that she would need to tell his father the full picture, and that she would not contact me again about financial matters without going through him first. He also told her that hiring someone to research my wife's private financial background was a violation that he was not going to minimize, and that she owed me an apology that would need to be genuine, not managed. The apology came 2 weeks later by phone. I won't describe it in detail because I think some things are private, but I will say that it was complicated and imperfect, and that I accepted it not because I had forgotten what happened, but because I had decided that forgiveness and foolishness are not the same thing. I forgave her. I also updated every access and authorization document with my attorney the following Monday. What I told my husband that evening when we were sitting on our back porch and the conversation had finally settled into something quieter was the full picture of what my father had left me and what I had done before our wedding to protect it. I told him everything. I told him about the engagement party and the question she had asked me near the kitchen doorway and how that question had sent me to Columbus 2 weeks later. I told him about the trust. I told him about the lake house in Vermont, which he had not known about and which I said I would very much like to take him to someday. He listened to all of it. Then he said he understood why I had structured things the way I had, and that he was glad I had, and that he was sorry his family had given me reason to be that careful before we were even married. Then he said, "Can we go to Vermont in October? I've never seen fall foliage." I said yes. I think about my father a lot when I think about what happened. He was not a dramatic man. He was not someone who gave speeches about legacy or made grand statements about what he was building and why. He just worked. He made decisions carefully. He protected what he had built, not out of greed, but out of a genuine belief that what you create with your effort deserves to be treated with respect. Before he died, he sat with me at his kitchen table in Columbus, not our kitchen table, his, the one I had eaten breakfast at my entire childhood, and he said, "When I'm gone, don't let anyone make you feel guilty about what I leave you. It isn't about the money, it's about the years." I understood what he meant then. I understand it more fully now. If you are a woman entering a marriage with inherited assets or assets of any kind, here is what I want you to hear. Protecting what you came into a marriage with is not a betrayal of your partner. It is not a sign that you expect the marriage to fail.
a prenuptial agreement, a trust, a consultation with an estate attorney, these are not expressions of distrust. They are expressions of responsibility. They are the equivalent of wearing a seatbelt in a car you have no intention of crashing. You don't put on a seatbelt because you plan to have an accident. You put it on because the world is unpredictable and because you respect your own life enough to protect it. My mother-in-law walked into my home with an attorney and documents because she believed I would be too uncomfortable, too eager to prove myself as a new wife, too concerned with keeping the peace to say no. She believed I would sign because signing would feel like belonging. She was not entirely wrong about how that pressure works. I had felt it standing at that kitchen door, watching her settle into my chair with her practiced smile. I had felt the pull of it, the desire to be generous, to be welcoming, to be the kind of daughter-in-law who doesn't make things difficult. What saved me was not that I was immune to that feeling. What saved me was that I had already made the decision before I needed to make it under pressure. My father's attorney and I had sat in his office in Columbus on a cold February afternoon and done the work, and by the time my mother-in-law arrived with her folio, the decision had already been made. You don't secure your house after the break-in, you secure it before. My husband and I have been married for 14 months now. The business debt on his mother's side is being handled through a structured repayment plan that his father negotiated after learning the full picture. It is slow and not particularly pleasant, but it is honest, which is more than what came before it. My husband and I cook dinner together on Tuesday nights. He's learning to make his grandmother's pasta sauce, which involves more patience than he naturally has, and we laugh about that regularly. We went to Vermont in October. The foliage was exactly what he had hoped for. We stayed at the lake house for 5 days. On the last morning, we sat on the dock with coffee as the sun came up over the water, and my husband said that he thought my father had very good taste in real estate. I said my father had very good taste in most things. I sat there with my coffee, and I thought about what it means to protect something, not out of fear, not out of suspicion, but out of respect for where it came from and what it cost. I thought about my father getting up before sunrise for 40 years. I thought about the February client site visits and the parking lot, and the years that became a company, that became a trust, that became eventually a dock on a lake in Vermont, where I sat with the man I married while the sun came up. Some things are worth protecting carefully. The most important part is deciding to protect them before anyone gives you a reason to.